Welcome back. Our previous lesson was on quantity regulation. Today we are moving on to consumer and producer surpluses. So what is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus describes the gain from buying something at a price below the highest price you'll be willing to pay, which is your marginal benefit. So assuming you go to the market and you're willing to pay £80 for a pair of jeans, but the price is only £50, your surplus or your gain from this transaction is £30. Consumer surplus can be calculated as the marginal benefit minus the price. So in this case, you're willing to pay £80 for the jeans, but the price of the jeans is £50. So your consumer surplus for this transaction is £30. So your consumer surplus from a single purchase is the difference between your marginal benefit and the price. However, the total consumer surplus across all buyers is the area under the demand curve above the price. So let's look at this market of jeans to calculate our total consumer surplus. Now we know that your consumer surplus from a particular transaction is just your marginal benefit minus the price. So if you go into the market willing to pay £80 for a pair of jeans, but the price is £50, your consumer surplus is just this difference here. So this difference is your consumer surplus from this purchase. However, in the entire market, the total consumer surplus across all buyers is this shaded area here, which is the area below the demand curve but above the price. So to calculate your total consumer surplus, you need to know the price prevailing in the market, which is the actual price of the good. And then you need to know the quantity demand or the quantity that is being sold in the market. And you also need to know the highest price that a consumer is willing to pay for the good. So to calculate our total consumer surplus, we just need to find the area of this triangle. Now we know that the area of a triangle can be found by using the formula half base times height. So let's use that to calculate our total consumer surplus. So we have half times the base of this triangle, which is the difference here, which is 200, times the height of this triangle, which can be found by subtracting 120 from 50. So this gives us a total consumer surplus of 7,000. One thing to note about consumer surplus is that when the demand curve is a straight line, consumer surplus is the right angle, which can be calculated by figuring out the area of that triangle, as we have done here. Now let's move on to producer surplus. Producer surplus describes the gain a producer gets from selling a product at a higher price than necessary for them to want to supply the item, which is their marginal cost. For example, if the price of a pair of jeans is £50, but the marginal cost is the £35 worth of denim, thread and labor it took to make that extra pair of jeans, then the producer surplus is £15. So this can also be calculated by subtracting the marginal cost from the price. So in this case, the price of the pair of jeans is 50, but the marginal cost of producing that one pair of jeans is 35. So the producer surplus in this market is £15. Now, as we did for consumer surplus, similarly for producer surplus from a single sale is the difference between the price the seller receives and the marginal cost. However, the total producer surplus across all sellers is the area above the supply curve below the price out to the quantity sold. So looking at this curve, if the price of the jeans is 50, but the marginal cost of producing just that one pair of jeans is 35, then the difference here is the producer surplus from this sale. However, if you want to find the entire producer surplus or the total producer surplus across all sellers, then we have to find the area of this triangle. So this can also be found by calculating the area of that triangle using the formula half base times height. So in this case, half times the base of this triangle, which is again 200, and the height of this triangle, which can be obtained by subtracting 10 from 50. So 50 minus 10, and the answer is 4,000 pounds. So the total producer surplus in this market is 4,000 pounds. Now that we know consumer and producer surplus, let's combine the two to find what we call economic surplus. So economic surplus generated by a transaction is the sum of the consumer surplus enjoyed by a buyer, which is calculated as the marginal benefit minus the price, and the producer surplus accruing to the seller, which is also calculated by subtracting the marginal cost from the price of the good. So in this case, we can write economic surplus as consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Now remember that this is the same as writing consumer surplus is marginal benefits minus the price of a good, plus producer surplus, which is the price of a good minus the marginal cost. Now if we open up these brackets, we can rewrite this formula as marginal benefits minus price plus price minus marginal cost. But then the two prices can cancel out. So this leaves us with the formula for economic surplus as marginal benefit minus marginal cost. So economic surplus can either be found by adding consumer surplus and producer surplus, or it can simply be found as the marginal benefit minus the marginal cost of producing a good. So for example, if you buy a pair of jeans that brings you £80 worth of benefit, and the cost the seller incurred in producing that good is 35, then the transaction will create a £45 worth of economic surplus. So if you buy a pair of jeans and it gives you a marginal benefit of 80, but the marginal cost of producing that pair of jeans is 35, then the economic surplus from this transaction is £45. Now let's look at the curve for economic surplus. Economic surplus of a single transaction is the marginal benefit minus the marginal cost. However, total economic surplus is the area between the demand and the supply curves out to the quantity bought and sold. So, as we said before, if you buy a pair of jeans and it brings you £80 worth of marginal benefit, but the marginal cost of producing that pair of jeans is 35, then this difference here is the economic surplus from this sale. If you want to find the total economic surplus across the market, then we simply have to add the consumer surplus to the producer surplus, or add the entire marginal benefit and subtract it from the cost of producing the good. So in this case, it is the area between the demand and the supply curve out to the quantity bought or sold, and it is represented on this curve as this entire shaded area. So from our previous works, you can see that this area is consumer surplus and this area is producer surplus. So add the two, then you have your economic surplus. So we can calculate our economic surplus from in this market of jeans as well, just like we did for our producer surplus and our consumer surplus. So using the same formula, half base times height. So we have half, and the base of this triangle is again 200, and the height of this triangle is 120 here, which is the intersection of the demand curve, and then subtract 10 from that, which is the intersection of the supply curve. So this gives us 11,000 pounds, which is also the same as adding our consumer surplus was 7,000 and our producer surplus was 4,000. So whether you add consumer surplus to producer surplus or you calculate the economic surplus straight from the graph, you end up with the same answer. So this is all that we have for our lesson on consumer and producer surplus. Our next lesson will be on market efficiency. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.